Presidential primaries are a weird combination of decades of thousands of local parties creating their own rules, along with a national leadership that tries to stitch everything together. This means that the entire thing is a mess, with many people, sometimes even the candidates themselves, being practically clueless to exactly what's happening. One of the more important aspects in primaries is the phenomenon of momentum. Battles for the nomination can get ugly, so the leadership of both parties found that it's important to resolve them decisively so the party isn't divided when they go into the general election. To that end, primaries are done sequentially instead of all at once. This ensures that candidates who would receive only a small fraction of the vote run out of money, support, and hope early on, clearing the way for compromise candidates who can appeal to a broader portion of the electorate. Now, while it's clear that momentum is consciously created and/or promoted by the leadership of the political parties, the form it takes is more influenced by the messy actions of those thousands of local branches all working independently. Iowa and New Hampshire are the first states to vote, and, as such, have a vastly inflated role in influencing the presidential race, and from there, the fate of the entire world. In fact, these two states, merely by being first in the primaries, could easily have more global political clout than entire nations. And how did this happen? Why is Iowa first? Well, basically, it was an accident. And while there's an interesting discussion to have on whether this is bad for our democracy, I'm here to discuss how it actually impacts the presidential primaries. Momentum is obviously beneficial and leads to candidates doing better than they would have otherwise, but the benefits come in janky ways that can be hard to quantify. There are two main types of momentum. The first, breakout momentum, is common in crowded primaries. It happens when a candidate who only had a few percent of support gets noticed. Examples are the 2004 Dem primary and the 2012 Republican primary. The second, which I call feasibility momentum, is when the candidate goes from simply being known to being a credible contender for the nomination. An example would be Obama in 2008. There are several ways momentum helps. First, it generates establishment support in the form of institutional donors and political assistance. The big companies and millionaires who donate typically expect some level of influence if the candidate becomes president, and they don't like throwing their money down the drain with somebody who has little chance of winning. Likewise, sitting politicians give endorsements, networking opportunities, and organizational support to candidates, but they also expect some form of reciprocity. The next benefit momentum brings is the greater media exposure to voters who are on the fence or completely unaware of the candidate's existence. Third, momentum generates added enthusiasm for volunteers of an organization, helping get out the vote drives and local coverage. Finally, perhaps the most interesting benefit is that increasing electoral support increases electoral support. In other words, bandwagon voters will drop candidates who are better ideological matches in favor of supporting a rising star. Perhaps even more interesting is the fact that this happens a lot. This is an econometric concept known as social learning, and is way more complex than the time I have to discuss it. But for a very brief overview, it's the phenomenon that all voters have incomplete information on the candidates, so voters in later states look for cues from voters in early states and change their opinions accordingly. The reason I bring up the topic of momentum is because the first votes in the Democratic primary are happening soon in Iowa on February 1st and in New Hampshire on February 9th. Both states are overwhelmingly white, which helps Sanders since he's winning the white liberal demographic. However, on February 27th, South Carolina hosts its primary, which has significantly more minorities who, thus far, seem to mostly be supporting Hillary, for some reason. This sets up an interesting dynamic, where Hillary's lead in the national polls could be wiped away by the first two states voting for Sanders. The news media will have a big part in this. In my opinion, they seem to be shilling more for Bernie than for Hillary, especially for online sites, so he already has that going in his favor. But even more important is the fact that the media loves good stories, and a Sanders victory in both states would generate headlines by the boatload. At this point, it's hard to understate how pivotal Iowa will be. I have 3 possible predictions for the results. If the vote turns out like the polls that show Hillary up by double digits, there will be a few sites saying Bernie did, quote, better than expected and that he's still competitive, and he'll still probably even win New Hampshire, but his campaign will pretty much be toast after that point when you look at the primary calendar. The next prediction is if you believe the polls that have Hillary up by single digits. Bernie will win New Hampshire, and the national polls will almost become competitive between the two. However, his support will start melting once we get into the spring competitions. He'll have some states where he's walloped, some where he's close, and maybe even a few that he wins, but it'll be clear that his trajectory is downwards. The money will dry up, the bandwagon voters will move on, and the primary will become obvious after a few months. The final prediction is if you believe the polls that have Bernie up over Hillary in Iowa. He'll certainly win New Hampshire, and at that point it becomes a question of how big will the momentum be? Will there be enough undecided or bandwagon voters that the tide can turn for Bernie? My thought is, yeah, possibly. This will create a long slog to the nomination similar to what the Dems experienced in 2008. Hillary is too well organized and entrenched to be defeated outright, but a combination of enthusiasm for Sanders, the media wanting headlines, and a shift of establishment support that momentum would bring could give Bernie his chance to clinch the nomination. With all that being said, I still think Bernie is by far the underdog candidate. Even if he inches out a victory in Iowa, I still wouldn't put his overall chances above 50%. But it will give him a much better chance, and it will promise to make this election cycle even more interesting than it already has been.